This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Seven children dead after a classroom collapsed at school in Kenyan capital Nairobi. British travel firm Thomas Cook collapses, stranding hundreds of thousands. And world leaders and diplomats in New York for the UN General Assembly. Hello and a warm welcome to Africa Live. I am Peninah Karibe. Also coming up this hour, ongoing demonetization and cuts in government spending on focus as Kenya's Monetary Policy Committee convenes. And in sports, Namibia proud of their Rugby World Cup opener despite going down 47-22 to Italy. We begin the bulletin with some distressing news from Kenya's capital, Nairobi, where at least 7 students have been confirmed dead after their school's classroom collapsed this morning. The structure at the Precious Talent School came down just as the pupils were preparing to start learning at around 7 this morning local time. School managers could not estimate the number of students who were in class when the structure caved in. Several others have been injured and many remain unaccounted for as they ran away from the scene after the incident occurred. Some 57 pupils are currently in hospital following the incident. Dozens of others are stuck under the rubble and rescue efforts are ongoing as emergency services battle to save the remaining trapped students. The school says the classroom may have collapsed as a result of a sewer line that was recently dug behind the structure, weakening its foundation. Investigations are currently underway and an official report will be given at a later date.
Rescue efforts are currently ongoing. However, according to reports, there's been ongoing construction of a sewer which may likely have caused the collapse. This institution attracts many students as it offers affordable education.
Robert Nagila has been following this story for us and joins us on the line for more. Robert, some devastating news out of that school this morning. Paint us a picture of the magnitude of the tragedy. Robert, are you there? Well, I'm afraid we seem to have lost Robert. We'll try and reconnect with him. Now, a huge repatriation effort is underway following the collapse of Thomas Cook, the world's oldest travel company. It ran hotels, resorts, airlines and cruises for 19 million people a year in 16 countries. The British tour operator has left around 600,000 customers stranded abroad, forcing government and insurance companies to coordinate on a massive scale. Plagued by debt, online competition and geopolitical uncertainty, the company failed to secure a last-minute rescue package. The UK Civil Aviation Authority has stated that Thomas Cook has now ceased trading. With flights cancelled, 150,000 British holidaymakers are waiting to be brought back home.
This is a huge operation, 150,000 people currently abroad. We've chartered over 40 aircraft and those aircraft are already in position, and then in the next few hours we'll start bringing passengers home. The Civil Aviation Authority is focused on bringing back people to the UK. That's what our role is. In other countries in Europe, the regulator and the governments will be responsible for the arrangements in their areas.
Let's take a look at the company's history.
For decades, Thomas Cook has been synonymous with modern mass-market tourism. It's taken generations of Britons on their summer holidays to Europe and around the world. With annual sales of $11 billion and 22,000 staff in 16 countries, Thomas Cook has come a long way from its humble roots in the rural English Midlands. It was in 1841 in the small town of Market Harborough that local furniture maker Thomas Cook, a former Baptist preacher, set up small business. He began by taking fellow church members on day trips. But within a decade, Thomas Cook had revolutionized the European tourism industry, organizing mass excursions throughout the continent and later beyond. He died in 1892 when the business was taken over by his 3 grandsons. They later expanded into the winter holiday market. In the post-war years of the 50s, over 1 million Britons a year began taking their holidays abroad with the Thomas Cook. In recent times, however, Thomas Cook has struggled with the rise of online travel agents, low-cost do-it-yourself travel. More recently, there's also been political unrest in its key markets, such as Egypt and Tunisia. Thomas Cook has insisted the standard package holiday remains the most popular option for many Britons, and that it does have a viable future. But the oldest travel giant is filing for bankruptcy after failing to secure a rescue deal. The company seems to have reached the end of its own historical journey. Youyang, CGTN.
CGTN's Naweed Jabakil is in London and joins us now for more on this. Naweed, can you give us the latest on this? How many tourists and employees have been affected?
Yeah, well, we're here outside London Gatwick Airport, where it's been fairly quiet outside the Thomas Cook desk. Most people seem to be taking the advice to stay away. In terms of the company that's folded, it's the world's oldest travel firm. Started in 1841, Thomas Cook. In total, 21,000 employees. Their jobs are at risk here. 600,000 passengers that are currently abroad, including 150,000 UK travellers. Now, the company has folded as of this morning. Late night talks to try and save the company weren't successful. The UK government has stepped in and said that they're going to try and take the mantle to repatriate those British travellers, 150,000 British travellers who are currently abroad. But the reverberations of Thomas Cook's collapse could have far-reaching consequences for the industry.
Right, talk to us about that repatriation exercise that you just mentioned.
Yeah, well, it's called Operation Matterhorn, and it has a sort of wartime name about it because this is the largest repatriation in peacetime in British history. It's quite a big operation. 150,000 British passengers will be brought home. The government has said that it's going to bear the brunt of that cost, most likely to the taxpayer, that will be to the UK taxpayer. But it did reject the $178 million last-minute bailout for the company. Boris Johnson said that that wouldn't be the right thing to do because essentially the company's fundamentals weren't good enough, and if it did give it another bailout, that eventually it would have collapsed. That's the government's view. So instead they're taking matters into their own hands to bring home passengers, and I think there's going to be some reassurance for the hundreds of thousands, 150,000 Brits who are currently stuck abroad. It will take about 2 weeks before they're all brought home, but the government has chartered about 45 additional planes itself, seeing as Thomas Cook's planes are currently grounded.
And now wait, this is the world's oldest travel company. It has just folded. Talk to us about the trends in the travel sector that are behind the collapse of Thomas Cook.
Yeah, look, it's twofold here. First of all, there were certain sectoral issues, industry issues that faced Thomas Cook, including oil prices. We've seen them rise in the past couple of years. We've also seen the pound fall in that time as well. Sterling has dropped largely by Brexit uncertainty, which the company actually said was one of the main issues for its collapse. So a weaker pound, higher oil prices, and competition, of course, is fierce in the industry, notoriously fierce in the airline industry across Europe here, where budget airlines are pretty much active in every single country. But then there are also problems for the company itself. A lot of people would say that the writing's been on the wall for many years, and that this hasn't been completely out of the blue. Just in August, the company agreed a rescue deal worth £900 million with its largest shareholder, the Chinese company Fosun, leading those talks. This latest round of talks, which collapsed last night, was thought to be an extension of that rescue deal, but it hasn't gone through. So there were sectoral issues that the company faced, as well as particular issues, structural issues that the company faced within its management, that lots of people are pointing the finger towards Thomas Cook's management. But essentially the world's oldest travel firm started in 1841. It's now collapsed, and the real impact of its demise will be clearer in the days and weeks to come. Back to you.
All right, Naweed, thank you for that update. Naweed Jabakil live for us in London. Now let's take you back to our top story this hour. At least 7 students have been confirmed dead after their school classroom collapsed this morning here in Nairobi. The structure at the Precious Talent School came down just as the pupils were preparing to start learning at around 7 a.m. local time. Robert Nagila is finally back online for us. So, Robert, talk to us about the magnitude of this tragedy. Just paint us a picture of that.
Okay, Peninah. Well, just before I go into that, let me just bring you up to the latest information. In the last few minutes, the Minister for Education, that's the Cabinet Secretary, has just addressed the press and given an update on the situation on the ground. Now, Mr. Magoha says that as of this moment, 7 children confirmed dead, another 64 admitted at the Kenyatta Hospital, which is the country's largest referral hospital. Then you've got some children also taken to other hospitals in and around Nairobi. Now, of the 64, what we know is that 2 of them are in serious condition. The remaining 62 are said to have superficial injuries and are expected to be released later today after they've been treated. Now, what we do know about this particular situation, Peninah, is at about 7 a.m. this morning, the school, which houses about 700 or 800 students, collapsed. Now, at that particular time, the students would have been in the classrooms, and that's why there is a high number of students who were killed during that particular incident. As yet, we still do not know the cause of this particular incident. However, we've heard from the owner of this private school who says that the county government, the local county government, was building a sewerage line behind the school, and he believes that could have caused the school to collapse. But investigations have been instituted by the police, and we're still waiting to get further information as to what may have caused this particular incident. Now, there have been local media has also interviewed some of the parents. Now, some say they're yet to access their children in hospital. They've not seen their children as yet, but they've been told that their children are in hospital. One parent told the media that he actually rushed his daughter to hospital because the emergency services were simply late to arrive on the scene, and he decided to take his kids to hospital. So some of the stories already beginning to come up, Peninah.
All right, Robert, thank you for that update. Robert Nagil on the line for us here in Nairobi. You're watching Africa Live. Let's take a quick break. Coming up. Well, leaders and diplomats in New York for the UN General Assembly. And Somalia forms national graft body to tackle corruption.
I've learned how to code in a simple way.
Together with other young people, we're able to make this difference.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
All right, one of the lead stories we're following for you this hour is that Thomas Cook story that we woke up to, that it has folded. A huge repatriation as a result of that is underway following the collapse of Thomas Cook. It is the world's oldest travel company. We just heard from a reporter in London on that repatriation exercise. So let's get now another view from Cairo's. Yasser Hakim is live for us. Yasser, thousands of UK holidaymakers are stranded. Some of them are there in Egypt, others are in Tunisia. Can you give us an update on the situation there in Egypt?
Yes, it's been a big surprise for all of them, obviously, and for the whole sector in both countries, in Tunisia and Egypt, concerning what happens to Thomas Cook. There are many tourists, British tourists in particular, in both countries. Maybe it's not the high season at the moment, which is also might be easier for authorities to repatriate the tourists. What we know is that the higher seasons are in summer, and then starting October, November, the winter season that's when you see an increase, a major increase in tourists. But right now, the repatriation is coming from Hurghada in the Red Sea and Marsa Alam. That's where most of the Thomas Cook clients are situated at the moment. The planes, as you understand, are now being prepared to take them back, and some have already been back. There's been some issues with some tourists, especially in Tunisia, where a hotel, for example, a couple of times have stopped tourists from leaving the hotel, and they were held inside the hotel to ensure that until he gets the guarantee that the hotel will get paid, knowing after the news broke out that Thomas Cook has gone bust, and the hotel had held the tourists there until the Ministry of Tourism in Tunisia interfered and gave the hotel the guarantees that this hotel will get paid the money owed by Thomas Cook, and the tourists were let go. So this is obviously a very sad situation for the tourists and for officials in both countries.
Yeah, and yeah, so what kind of impact do you think this will have on Egypt's tourism?
Obviously, any reduction in tourist numbers will have an impact, especially that Thomas Cook for Egypt was actually going on an expansion plan that was put forth and announced just a couple of months ago in August, whereby Thomas Cook has already began preparations to open or to inaugurate its first hotel and the 5th hotel around the world, and that's in Egypt. Only 5 hotels around the world, Thomas Cook hotels, and this is one of them in Egypt, in the Red Sea, and it was called Casa Cook. Was supposed to open in October, of 144 rooms, and that was one of the expansion plans. Thomas Cook had announced also just a few weeks ago that the number of tourists in the summer in 2019 have increased by 35% to the year before. And reservations for the winter season, which is coming up in October, have increased by more than 55% than the year before. So the numbers were very optimistic. It looks positive. It looked positive for the tourism sector, but this now, it seems that it has all gone. Whether other companies will take in these reservations, the tourists, will they be going to other destinations or coming to Egypt using other companies than Thomas Cook? This remains to be seen. But obviously, these are big numbers that has been affected by what has happened in the last 24 hours.
All right, Yasser, thank you for that. Yasser Hakim live there in Cairo. Now, the United Nations headquarters in New York will welcome world leaders and top diplomats on Tuesday at the annual General Assembly debate. But before that, the spotlight on Monday will be on climate change. It's CGTN's Lillington with more.
A very busy week ahead when world leaders convene here in the annual gathering of prime ministers, presidents and foreign ministers at the United Nations General Assembly High-Level Week. Now, we'll be hearing from world leaders Tuesday morning with speeches from the heads of governments and heads of state. But before all these speeches kick off, there will be a major summit on Monday, a full day before the remarks to the General Assembly, where world leaders will be attending the Climate Action Summit convened by the Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Now, this has been planned for weeks, and the UN chief has been very clear about what he wants out of this climate session. He's told world leaders that he does not want fancy speeches, but he wants concrete commitments towards limiting the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. He has made it clear that only countries with the boldest and most courageous plans will be able to address the General Assembly on Monday. Now, we do expect China to speak at the summit around midday. China's State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi is scheduled to address the Council around midday on coal to clean energy. We do not expect the United States to attend or participate. I'm Li Lingtan for CGTN at the United Nations.
Meanwhile, a new weather agency report released ahead of the climate summit has shown that the world is falling badly behind in the race to avert climate disaster as a result of runaway warming. The report, compiled by the UN World Meteorological Organization, highlights the urgent need for the development of concrete actions.
We are at risk of crossing several critical tipping points in the planetary systems. And I think there's also in the science community a greater recognition of the fact that climate impacts are hitting harder and sooner than what climate assessments had estimated almost a decade ago.
The pledges made in Paris are in an order where we need to at least triple them if we're going to be below 2 degrees, and we need to at least fivefold or even more if we are aiming for the 1.5 degrees. So we really talk about a major increase in ambition. That's what this whole summit is about. The other one is then, of course, looking at are they actually doing the things they promised in Paris, and that's a more sort of mixed picture, because some countries are doing more than they promised, but sometimes it's because the promises were quite low.
Well, let's take you to Ethiopia, where delegates are meeting to discuss climate change solutions on the African continent. The meeting, well, it was organized by the African Union and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. It aimed to find an action plan ahead of next month's UN Climate Action Summit, as CGTN's Coletta Wanjohi reports.
As the world grapples with the effect of climate change, the consequences across Africa are becoming more urgent.
Early this year, tropical cyclones Idai and Kenneth ripped through 5 African countries, Mozambique, Malawi, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, and the Comoros, both within a period of 1 month. More than 1,000 lives lost, $100 billion in damages, and it will take at least $2 billion, perhaps more, to mount an effective recovery and the needed rehabilitation efforts.
Delegates from countries around Africa are here to prepare for an upcoming UN Climate Summit. They say there is no shortage of ideas, but the answer lies in implementation.
Since the Paris Agreement was concluded, emissions have not necessarily come down, or if they have come down, it's not at the rate that was anticipated in the agreement, and it's certainly not at the rate that is necessary to ensure that we do avoid dangerous interference with the climate system. So we do know that there are problems. There are a multitude of problems that need to be addressed.
The UN says Africa is only responsible for 4% of greenhouse gas emissions, but 65% of the continent is directly impacted by climate change. So African governments are being urged to take action.
We have the solution to climate change and only need the political will to make it happen. Then the intriguing question that immediately arises is, why is political will so lacking?
Part of the problem is finding the funds. Nearly $3 trillion is needed to finance plans to tackle climate change, according to the UN. African countries hope to get this from their national budgets, continental financial institutions, and foreign assistance. Developed nations have pledged $100 billion annually to help developing countries deal with environmental issues. African delegates are calling on them to deliver on this commitment, because without their backing, climate plans could remain an empty promise. Coletta Wanjohi, CGTN, in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Just a quick pointer, that meeting was held last month ahead of this week's UN Climate Action Summit in New York. Now let's take you to Hong Kong, where Chief Executive Carrie Lam says the city has continued to prosper under the one country, two systems principle. She made remarks in a reception to mark the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. Carrie Lam also called for unity and vowed to stop the ongoing violence.
As China develops rapidly, Hong Kong has taken advantage of this, maintained steadiness and prosperity, and made continuous progress. In recent months, Hong Kong has faced huge challenges. The lives of the residents have been affected. The SAR government will do its best to stop the violence, restore social order, and guarantee workers' jobs. Hong Kong workers are diligent and committed. With the support of the central government, I believe as long as we stand in solidarity, Hong Kong is embracing a brighter future.
On to Somalia, which has embarked on the formation of a national graft body to tackle corruption. CGTN's Abdulaziz Bello reports from Mogadishu on how the new anti-corruption law will take effect.
It's the latest in efforts to tackle graft in one of the world's most corrupt nations. Halfway into his 4-year term, Somalia's President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo has signed into law an anti-corruption bill, months after Parliament endorsed it. The signing now sets the stage for the formation of federal and state levels graft bodies.
This law is very crucial in the campaign against graft. It's corruption that is to blame for the challenges Somalia is facing now. Developed countries have made strides due to lack of corruption. It's time to prioritize national interest. After doing so, we can be able to guarantee security and economic progress.
For over a decade, Mogadishu has been ranked bottom of Transparency International's corruption index. Analysts say that despite commitment from authorities, there are as yet few signs of comprehensive anti-corruption reform taking place in the Horn of African nation.
The signing of this bill is a step in the right direction. However, the government must ensure that this law operates effectively to tackle corruption. Institutions must be empowered to address endemic corruption. This is a major undertaking which will require commitment from authorities.
Last year, a total of 8 junior government officials were convicted by a Mogadishu court over corruption, the first major convictions since the fall of the central government almost 3 decades ago. A National Anti-Corruption Commission is now expected to pursue top government officials accused of mismanaging funds and abuse of office.
Corruption is not just mismanagement of funds or looting public funds, using force and position of power for personal gains. It's also corruption. This law is meant to create justice to all those accused of corruption and deter officials from engaging in the act.
The country has in the past months begun engaging global financial institutions. Last year, World Bank approved $80 million in grants to Somalia to fund public finance reforms, marking the first disbursement in 30 years. Officials say the new law will now give the donor community renewed faith in the country. Abdulaziz Bilo, CGTN, Mogadishu, Somalia.
Chirping of birds, sounds of whispering trees, burbling of streams. When sunlight sets the forest's leaves aglow and waterfall surges down from the mountain, we see and hear the Earth's wondrous beauty. The Earth is meant to be appreciated, and the life of its inhabitants deserves our endless exploration. Come with CGTN to listen and see, in chorus of life, to marvel at nature and life.
You're watching Africa Live. Coming up in business news, ongoing demonetization and cuts in government spending on focus as Kenya's Monetary Policy Committee convenes, and Nigeria loses crude oil worth $1.3 billion to vandals.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
In Kenya, the phasing out of the 1,000 shilling note at the end of this month are the key concerns as the Monetary Policy Committee meets on Monday. On the agenda in the meeting is the escalating of public debts and austerity measures by National Treasury. Meanwhile, the Kenya shilling continued to hold against the US dollar ahead of the MPC meeting. On Thursday, commercial banks quoted the shilling at 103.75, 103.95 per dollar, the same as Wednesday's close. In its last meeting in July, the MPC said the full market has remained relatively stable, supported by the narrowing of the current account deficit. This trend is attributed to strong growth in diaspora remittances and the resilient performance of exports, particularly horticulture, among others. Oil theft is still a very big problem in Nigeria, and the country's National Economic Council now says the situation has reached a critical point that demands urgent action. Here's CGTN's Deji Badmas with more on that story.
It's a problem that has simply refused to go away, and now a special committee set up by the Nigerian government to investigate the level of oil theft in its oil industry says things are getting worse.
22.6 million barrels of crude oil, valued at approximately $1.35 billion, was lost during the first half of this year. And that if this situation is not contained, by full year we would have lost in excess of $2.7 billion.
For a country that is really struggling with its revenue, it's a massive loss. And this is despite several efforts by the government at checking oil theft. The committee revealed that the country's oil pipelines are usually the major target, including some of the major export lines.
The governance structure of the pipelines is such today that no one is held accountable whenever there are breaches and when these losses occur. That the slow and inadequate prosecution of thieves, despite numerous arrests and seizures, have continued to encourage this menace. That the absence of petroleum products filling stations in most of the oil-producing communities around the Niger Delta make them resort to illegal bunkering and illegal refineries.
Some of these findings are actually not new. The challenge is that the oil thieves always seem to be one step ahead of every solution thrown at the problem so far.
There is a need to restructure the maintenance and ownership of all pipelines as a way of tackling the perpetrators of crude and other products. That we should have a legal framework that will ensure that criminals are duly prosecuted, imprisoned, and their assets confiscated. That there should be special courts to try offenders and also have a special legal task force to coordinate the prosecution of arrested offenders, as well as train special judges to handle cases of oil theft.
The police has now been charged to further increase security around the country's oil pipelines and ensure the oil theft is stopped. But most experts say the only way to decisively deal with the issue of oil pipeline vandalism is to deploy a high-tech surveillance system, something the government has not managed to do so far. Perhaps this latest report by the committee would compel it to act along that line. Deji Badmos, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
Zimbabwe's central bank has tightened the rules governing the trade of foreign currency by Foreign Exchange Bureau with immediate effect. The bank says the rates offered by Exchange Bureau must be 7% above or below the interbank mid-rate. Failure to comply to the new rules would result in either heavy financial penalties or license revocation. Since a parity peg to the US dollar was dropped in February, the local currency has slumped to 13.85 against the dollar, making it the world's worst performer. The new rules come after the government declared a state of disaster last week, threatened by the country's worst ever famine after harvests were hit by a drought and cyclone-induced floods. The Minerals Council of South Africa reports the likelihood of an additional carbon tax cost of $36 million over the next 3 years. This follows a survey of 18 of its larger members. The carbon tax was introduced into South Africa in May this year. CGTN's Angela Coppola has the details.
Analysts say that generally the mining industry is carbon intensive and miners can't pass on these new costs, which means that the new tax drops straight down to the bottom line of a mine. The sector is increasingly concerned about the Phase 2 component, which starts in 2022.
Phase 2 component, the offsets right now, there's no clarity on if the offsets remain. And again, working on worst case scenario, we then have to assume that all the offsets are removed. The rate then also gets adjusted by CPI plus 2. And at that point, then we are working on an estimate of 170 Rand a tonne at that time.
The 18 mines in South Africa that responded to the survey are likely to face carbon tax costs estimated at $380 million in Phase 2 of the implementation of the new tax. It's considered a punitive tax by the Minerals Council.
So it's not an advocacy to say that the carbon tax should be scrapped, but what we are saying is that it should be contained as part of a toolbox. That toolbox includes, one, the carbon tax, carbon offsets, carbon budgets, things that incentivize, or carbon incentives as well, that incentivize companies to invest in green energy and then get that benefit to offset that against the tax.
The uncertainty around the details, incentives and offsets of the carbon tax have already been expressed by several mines in reporting their latest interim results.
Some companies already come out with their half-yearlies and impaired some of their South African assets because you rerun your mine model, you include a carbon tax into your cut-off grade, it adversely affects the cut-off grade, you impair your assets, you reduce the life of mine, jobs are lost in the long term, even in the short term.
The mining sector is a long-term play, and that planning needs to be done well in advance, sometimes up to a decade ahead. And that's why they need certainty in terms of this carbon tax and what the incentives and offsets are going to be going forward. I'm Angelo Coppola for CG10 in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Now to the ongoing strike against General Motors by the United Auto Workers. About 250 UAW members picketed at an auto assembly plant near Detroit on Sunday as their strike entered its second week. Nearly 50,000 General Motors workers walked off the job last week to start the largest strike against the car maker in more than a decade. That came after talks on a new 4-year contract hit an impasse. Meanwhile, Flint, Michigan, the birthplace of General Motors, is also bracing for the economic impact from the strike.
Well, back in '98, when I went out at AC Sparkplug on strike with Chevy Metal Fab, behind me, our motto then was one day longer. And that's what we're going to be. We're going to hold out one day longer.
City's coming up, but it needs a lot of help still. And that's where the people that are working in these plants help out the city. And it's important to keep a city like this, keep these plants here.
China is pushing the innovation envelope with payment technology. Mobile payments and QR codes are popular. And now, a new way to make purchases is on the rise. As CGTN's Gerald Tan tells us, this method is even easier and faster.
You're at the store with no money, no cards, no phone. No problem. If you want to buy something at this self-service supermarket in Tianjin, all you do is smile.
iFury's main research direction is unmanned stores, and we have been developing facial recognition technology for 2 years.
China is trailblazing facial recognition payment systems. Alipay, the financial arm of e-commerce titan Alibaba, has already installed cash register machines equipped with cameras in more than 100 cities. Developers say the technology is convenient and safe.
Facial recognition software is designed to read the geometry of our faces, certain landmarks that are called nodal points. Examples include the distance between the eyes, the distance from forehead to chin, the length of the jawline, and the width of the nose. Each human face has about 80 nodal points that do not change over time in adulthood, and together they make up one's facial signature.
But the technology raises several privacy issues, including mistaken identity, the illegal collection of facial data, and the exploitation of one's facial signature. Yet many shoppers remain unfazed.
Once you finish all the registration, it becomes easier to buy and pay for goods. This kind of payment is very convenient and saves our time.
The popular food chain Weedome Bakery is an early adopter of the facial payment system, where it's available in hundreds of its outlets across China.
The new technology helps reform our original business model and business process by increasing efficiency. I don't even need to bring a mobile phone with me. I can go out shopping without taking anything.
Many Chinese startups are buying into this emerging technology. There's even a push to add beauty filters to the cameras for shoppers who want to look like $1 million even as they spend a little less. Gerald Tan, CGTN, Washington.
Meanwhile, China and the Solomon Islands signed a joint communique in Beijing on Saturday. The two countries agreed to establish diplomatic relations. The communique was signed by the Chinese State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi and the Solomon Islands Minister of Foreign Affairs Jeremiah Manele. Still ahead on Africa Live. Johannesburg exhibition showcases the best of South Africa and French comics and animation.
Join us in global business and see Africa through our eyes.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Peninah, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
South Africa's comic culture is getting a dose of French flair. France is the third biggest comics producer in the world, selling over 45 million books a year. The Art of Comics is the first exhibition of its kind, bringing together experienced French artists and up-and-coming African talent. CGTN's Julie Shire has more.
Comics are an important part of French culture, but Africa has yet to find its place in this fantastical world. The Art of Comics at the Johannesburg Art Gallery is a meeting of old universe comic creators and a new world order.
So I took it upon myself to create a narrative that's centered around South African women specifically, called Mapula, which is an augmented reality comic book. One thing that's very important also about the fact that it's augmented reality is that it shifts how people interact with space. So it's almost like this bit of magic that happens when art and technology kind of meet.
The French band dessinée, referred to as the ninth art, is hugely popular, and it can help influence young artists on the continent.
Comic art is one of the greatest art in culture in general. And French comics is very important, I think, in the world, because really for his diversity, the quality of the writing too, of the narrative thinking.
The collaboration between the two countries will also provide workshops and training to introduce young learners to the comic universe.
For many people, our first experience of art and storytelling is through comics, and we can't forget that the comics are part of the fine art tradition, and I think that it's time that we acknowledge that again. And celebrate them as a form of art which is accessible to everybody.
I think that we have to work on both directions, working with the children, with the schools, for example, to start reading comics from the early age, but also with the very famous cultural institutions, museums, contemporary galleries, to show that really comics is an art and that it's worth devoting time and spending energy, money, and artistic creation in it.
Comics have a way of connecting with your inner child, taking you to parallel worlds, but at the same time they provide serious social commentary. Julie Shire, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
And staying in South Africa, locals in Durban enjoyed an exhibition from China's Quanzhou by visiting Quanzhou Intangible Culture and Art Troupe. The event featured craftwork, calligraphy and marionette shows. Here's more from Daniel Arap Moy.
Over 600 locals attended the event that was held at the famous Gateway Shopping Center in Gabon. The exhibition featured Chinese art and calligraphy. 7 craftsmen from Fujian province displayed their unique skills in stone engraving and clothing display, which Kianzu is famed for. The visiting troupe also presented a unique marionette show titled Monkey Fun, which featured dolls playing guitar, dancing disco and riding bicycles. One even changed clothes 4 times as another participated in writing Chinese characters.
We are a hub of activity, we're a hub for culture and different demographics and loads of different people, so we thought it would be really nice to expose some of the art and talent that the Confucius Institute has brought to us today, and I think it's just something completely different.
The event was jointly organized by the Durban University's Confucius Institute, the Chinese Embassy in South Africa, and the Kianzu Tourism Department. September having been set aside as China's Heritage Month, the exhibition is meant to foster closer cultural ties between South Africa and China. Daniel Arab Moy, CGTN.
To Tanzania now, where locals have had a fun day with a goat race. The annual Rotary Goat Race is meant to raise funds for charity while allowing locals to cheer as goats race for top honors. Here's more on that from CGTN's Noah Otieno.
Just like it is with horses, each goat has a name.
2, 1, let's go!
As the clapper goes, Dar es Salaam goes up in cheers as the goats race to the finish line. This is the second annual Rotary Goat Race. It is a race that is aimed at raising funds for charity work and, yes, spread some fun.
I think it was picked up basically from Uganda, and again it was started off as a charitable thing, and only, like I said, only last year that's when we picked it up. After seeing that it has a lot of traction, a lot of followers, people love it, and the turnout is normally amazing. So it's one way that's like, okay, we want to make it bigger, want to make it better.
Unlike horses, which run all the way to the last stop, goats need jockeys or minders who keep them in their lanes. Just like it is with the horses, bets are placed on favorite goats to take the trophy. Only that the funds go to charity. Pet names for racing goats make it a worthwhile venture, as locals are treated to a new face of these livestock.
Name is Jerry Khan. He's racing to end water poverty in Africa.
Most locals in Tanzania and the East African region often view goats as a delicacy. Noah Otieno, CGTN.
Coming up in sports. Namibia proud of their Rugby World Cup opener despite going down 47-22 to Italy.
Africa, where champions are made, records are broken, legends are born. We're there for every goal,